I had heard plenty of cruel things in my life, from drunks at the factory floor to neighbors slamming their doors when I was a boy. But nothing struck deeper than when my own son leaned across my kitchen table and said, "You're not family anymore." He said it with a sharpness that rattled the spoons in the coffee mug between us. It was late afternoon, sunlight falling in broken squares across the linoleum, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I had raised him, carried him on my shoulders to Little League, paid for Brace's college and his first car. Yet in that instant, he looked at me as if I were just a stranger taking up space in his house. That was the moment the blood inside me turned cold. I'm 71 years old, born in Ohio, a retired machinist who worked 42 years at the same plant until it closed its gates for good. My hands still carry the grime of steel and oil, the kind that never washes out. I live in a small house at the edge of town, one I bought in 1978, when my wife and I scraped together every dollar we had. The shingles sag a little now, and the screen door creaks, but to me it is more than wood and nails. It is where I buried my youth, where I laughed over pancakes with my kids, where I sat through storms with my late wife's hand in mine. My son used to run down the hallway in pajamas, his hair sticking up like straw, shouting about monsters in the closet. That hallway is narrower now, the wallpaper peeling, but I still see him there whenever I pass. That day he came to me already wound tight, his jaw set, like he had practiced the speech in the car before walking in. He complained about money, about how he deserved more from me, about how the house should eventually be his because he was the one who carried my blood. I listened calm at first, nodding the way I used to when he was a boy with skinned knees, but my patience thinned when his words turned sharp. "You owe me," he said. "I've given you enough of my time. You should be grateful I even stopped by." Grateful? As though my fatherhood were a debt unpaid, as though the years of love and sacrifice had been nothing but a ledger he could erase with a stroke of his tongue. I tried to remind him of who we were, of the mornings he sat on the porch beside me, as the sun broke through the mist of the times I lent him money without ever asking for it back. He cut me short. That was then. This is now. Don't think you can hang all that over my head forever. His eyes flicked toward the old lamp on the counter, the one I bought at a yard sale in 1983, brass base dented but still glowing soft amber each night. My wife used to read by that lamp when the kids were asleep, her voice carrying words of novels into the quiet. For him it was just clutter. For me it was a shrine. I stood slowly, my knees aching the way they always do, and set the coffee mug down with a steadiness that surprised me. "Son," I said, "you need to think about what you're saying." He looked back at me, his face tight, and then he spoke the line that cracked the world open. "You're not family anymore." The words didn't echo, didn't shout. They landed heavy and flat like a coffin lid closing. I saw the boy I raised vanish in that instant, replaced by a man whose pride had blinded him to the simplest truth. Blood ties can be cut by the tongue as easily as by a knife. The rest of the evening blurred. He stormed out tires, squealing down the gravel drive. I stood alone in the kitchen, the lamp throwing a halo of tired light across the table, and I felt the air shift around me, colder, emptier. I walked through the house, touching things I had not touched in years, the baseball glove still on a shelf in the garage, the rocking chair by the window, the photograph of us fishing at Lake Erie, both of us grinning with sunburned faces. Those objects whispered louder than his voice, reminding me of a bond that once had weight. And yet the silence told me that bond was gone. Later, as the clock ticked past midnight, I sat again at the kitchen table with the lamp at my elbow, its glow steady as a heartbeat. I pulled out the drawer where I kept my papers, the will I had written years ago with my wife before she passed. I unfolded it, the creases stiff, my name inked in a hand, younger and firmer than the one I held the pen with now. My son's name was there clear as day beside the words that would one day give him everything I had worked for. My chest burned as I stared at it. His words replayed in my head. "You're not family anymore." If that was true, then the paper in front of me was a lie. With slow, deliberate strokes, I began to change it. The pen scratched across the page, a sound louder than his car peeling away, louder than any argument we had ever had. The night outside was still crickets humming, but inside the house the decision weighed like thunder. I knew this act would mark the start of something irreversible. Once done, it could not be undone by apology or regret. The ink dried sealing more than just a line of inheritance. It sealed a truth. Family is not a birthright, but a covenant, and he had broken it. I set the pen down, the lamp flickering slightly as though it understood. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the enormity of what I had just done. In that quiet room with the shadows bending long across the walls, I felt both a release and a dread. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Tomorrow he would discover what had been erased, and nothing would ever be the same. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The pen still lay where I had dropped it, its black body glinting faintly in the lamp's circle of light. I did not touch it again. The paper folded and placed back into its envelope seemed to radiate a kind of heat from the drawer, as though it carried more fire than ink. I sat there for hours, my head bent in my hands, until the night broke open into gray morning. The rooster across the field crowed, and I realized my back was stiff from sitting so long in the same chair. I rose slowly and moved towards the window, pulling back the curtain to watch the dawn creep up over the neighbor's barn. Life looked ordinary outside, but nothing inside me was the same. The house felt different now, as if the walls had absorbed what had taken place. Every nail and board had seen me scratch my son's name from the future. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and dust. The floor, worn in spots where my wife once paced with a baby in her arms, carried the weight of my footsteps like they were heavier than before. The hallway, narrow and shadowed, echoed with the ghost of my boy's laughter, the memory of a child who once begged me to keep the closet door open so he could sleep without fear. I stood in that hallway for a long while, hand pressed against the wallpaper, where his tiny palm once rested when he toddled beside me. The same hand that now pointed at me with dismissal. Not family anymore. The phrase chewed at me until it left raw edges inside my chest. I walked into the living room where the recliner sagged with age. My wife, God rest her, had loved that chair, claiming it as her spot for Sunday naps, while the ball game played low on the television. Her blanket, still hung over the arm, faded to a dull rose. I buried my face in it, inhaling a scent that was more memory than fabric now. Grief and anger wrestled inside me. Anger at the boy who turned his back, grief at the woman who would have known what to say to him. She always had a way of bridging tempers, of pulling us back from the edge. Without her, words became weapons, and silence a wound that widened overnight. In the corner stood the old record player. I hadn't spun a vinyl in years, but my fingers traced the dust across its cover. When my son was 10, he used to sit cross-legged in front of it, while I played Johnny Cash, bobbing his head to the rhythm, as though those songs were stitched directly into his bones. He once told me he wanted to learn guitar, and I bought him a used one from a pawn shop. He strummed it for weeks until the strings broke, and then he left it leaning against the wall. It's still in the attic, cracked and forgotten. Somehow that guitar feels like the shape of our relationship now, once bright with promise, left broken with no one willing to restring it. I shuffled into the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee. The bitterness coated my tongue, but offered no comfort. I looked out the window at the patch of ground where my son once built a crooked treehouse with me. We hammered nails side by side, and I told him stories of how my father taught me to work with my hands. The treehouse has rotted through the boards, sagging the ladder missing rungs. I never had the heart to tear it down. Watching it decay felt truer somehow, a slow testimony to time and neglect. Much like us, it stands but cannot be climbed. The shock of his words hadn't dulled. If anything, the repetition of them in my head made them sharper, carving deeper lines inside me. I wondered if he slept soundly after saying such a thing. I wondered if he replayed it with regret, or if he justified it with pride. Pride can be a poison. I know because I've carried my own, and it has cost me more than once. Maybe he learned it from me. Maybe I modeled stubbornness without meaning to. But even so, I never thought he'd wield it against me so ruthlessly. By late morning, I needed air. I stepped outside onto the porch where the boards groaned under my weight. The fields stretched out golden and indifferent. A breeze stirred, carrying the smell of cut hay. Across the road, the old farmer waved to me as he loaded bales onto his truck. I lifted a hand, but didn't cross the street. I couldn't summon the words for small talk. The world around me hadn't shifted yet. My own world had tilted so far I barely recognized its horizon. I sat on the porch swing, its chains squealing, and stared at the driveway where my son's car had kicked gravel into dust. That dust still lingered in the air, as if refusing to settle. The hours dragged heavy. I tinkered in the garage, tightening bolts on tools that no longer had a purpose, wiping the same wrench 3 times, though it was already clean. My mind circled back to the will locked away in its drawer, to the black line of ink that had severed the tie on paper, just as his words had severed it in spirit. There was no taking it back. Not unless he came to me with more than apology, with proof that he still understood what family meant. Yet even imagining that felt impossible. He had drawn the line, and I had signed beneath it. Afternoon shadows lengthened, and I found myself sitting in the quiet again, staring at the family photographs on the mantel. One in particular caught my eye, the 3 of us together at the county fair, my wife holding a bag of cotton candy, my son on my shoulders reaching for the prize wheel. I took it down, studied it closely, and saw a detail I had never noticed before. My son's smile wasn't directed at me. It was angled toward his mother eyes, shining at her, as if I were only the legs he balanced on. I felt a jolt in my stomach, a realization that maybe I had misread pieces of our bond all along. Maybe his loyalty had always tilted elsewhere. That photograph, innocent and bright at the time, now looked like a warning I had overlooked. And in that discovery, the air inside the room thickened, as though the house itself was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I kept staring at that photograph until my eyes blurred. My son's little hand clutched a paper ticket from the fair, and his grin stretched wide, but it was angled away from me, fixed on his mother. I slipped the frame back on the mantel with a weight in my chest, as though I had stumbled on a truth I had been blind to for decades. The sound of the clock in the corner ticked louder than usual, each second, reminding me that time does not grant do-overs. What has been neglected only ripens into distance. The following week he called, his voice sharp even before I said hello. He wanted money plain and simple. Said there were bills he couldn't cover, that the cost of everything had gone up, that I should help, because I had more than I needed. He spoke with that impatient tone, as though it were my duty to bail him out. When I hesitated, his words came quick. "You're sitting on a paid-off house and a pension. Don't act like you can't." He didn't ask how I was, didn't ask if I needed anything, just leaned hard into the idea that I owed him. I thought about the decades when every paycheck I brought home was sliced thin by groceries, mortgage braces, and gas in his car. Back then, I never once turned to him and said, "You owe me." But here he was, grown with children of his own, treating me like an ATM with a pulse. I told him I'd think about it. His reply was a sigh thick with contempt. "You always act like your money is worth more than mine." Then the line went dead. That night, I sat at the table again, the lamp glowing, and remembered the countless times I had said yes to his requests. The time he asked for a loan to start his landscaping business that folded within a year. The time he needed cash for a down payment on a house he later sold for a profit, never returning a dime. Each time I told myself it was for family, that generosity would stitch us closer. Instead, it seemed to have frayed the fabric, teaching him that my sacrifices were his entitlement. Small hurts built like splinters under skin, each one festering, though I had ignored them at the time. Days later, he showed up unannounced. His truck rolled into the drive, dust clouding the air. He came in without knocking, glanced around the kitchen, and his eyes landed on the old lamp. "You still got this junk," he muttered. It was as if he wanted to scrape away every memory I held dear, piece by piece. I watched him move through the house, scanning for things he might claim one day, his gaze lingering on the walnut desk in the den, the tools in the garage. My wife and I had bought those things together, each carrying stories, but he looked at them like tags at an auction. When he turned to me, his mouth curled into a smirk. "You know, when this is all mine, I'm going to clean it out. Start fresh." He said it casually, but each syllable struck like a hammer on my ribs. I didn't tell him what I had done with the will. I just stared, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. He mistook my silence for weakness, or maybe consent. He leaned on the counter and said, "You should just sign the place over, now let me handle it. You can't keep up with it anyway." His tone carried that false kindness people use when they want to cover greed with a thin sheet of reason. I wanted to shout, but the words wouldn't form. My silence built a wall inside me, brick by brick. That evening, after he left with a beer from my fridge clutched in his hand, I walked the property lines in the fading light. The maple tree by the fence stood gnarled and steady, the same tree he once carved his initials into as a teenager. The marks were still faintly visible, weathered but present. I touched them and wondered how a boy who carved his name with such pride could now wish to erase everything tied to me. I stood there until the mosquitoes drove me back inside my heart, swelling with a mix of sorrow and fury. The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. It was his handwriting, quick and jagged, saying he'd stop by with paperwork to make things easier. I didn't need to guess what kind of paperwork he meant. My hands shook as I read it, the coffee cooling untouched beside me. He was moving faster than I expected, already planning to secure what he thought belonged to him. That arrogance, assuming my life's work was his for the taking, pushed something hard through my chest. It was no longer just about hurt feelings. It was about justice, about standing against the quiet theft of dignity. I folded the note, tucked it into the drawer with the will, and sat back in the chair, the lamp throwing its familiar amber glow. The two pieces of paper lay together, one a record of my choice, the other his expectation. Between them was a chasm neither of us could cross without breaking. My wife's photo smiled faintly from the mantel, as though she knew the battle had only just begun. And when the knock finally came at the door, harder and quicker than any son should give his father's house, I felt the air still. My fingers brushed the drawer handle, and I knew the time for silence had ended. The pounding on the door carried through the walls like a warning drum. When I opened it, my son stood there with a man in a pressed shirt and briefcase, the kind of fellow who spoke more with contracts than with conversation. My son introduced him with the stiff pride of someone showing off a weapon. "This is Mr. Keller. He's going to help us sort things out." Us. As though I had already agreed, as though my will were a formality he could wave away. The lawyer smiled thinly, his eyes sliding past me to the house behind, like he was cataloging what would be taken. They stepped inside, uninvited. The lawyer set papers on the kitchen table, spreading them across the wood like cards in a rigged game. My son leaned over him, pointing, tapping, talking fast. I barely heard the words. What rang in my head was the ease with which they treated my home like a chessboard. Every photograph on the walls, every crack in the floor reduced to bullet points in their scheme. I stayed standing. My son finally looked up, irritated. "Dad, sit down. We're trying to make this simple." Simple. The word was a knife. He wanted me to sign away, not just a house, but the story of my life. The lawyer slid a pen toward me. The same gesture I had made nights before, except my ink had cut his name out, while this one was meant to cut me out. My hand trembled not from weakness, but from the surge of rage I fought to contain. I refused the chair. "No," I said, flat and firm. The lawyer blinked surprised, but my son smirked like he had expected defiance and was already prepared to press harder. He raised his voice loud enough that the neighbors might hear through the windows. "You're making a fool of yourself. Do you want everyone to see you can't handle your own affairs?" And just like that, the gasoline caught fire. Later that day, my daughter called. Her voice was laced with accusation rehearsed from words he had likely fed her. "Dad, what's going on? I hear you're refusing help, that you're letting things fall apart." "Why are you being stubborn?" I tried to explain, but she cut me off quick and sharp. "We're worried about you. You need to think about what's best for everyone, not just yourself. Everyone." As if my sacrifice all these years had been selfishness. I hung up with my ears burning. It was not just him now. He had pulled others into the circle, building a case that painted me as unfit, unreasonable. The family atmosphere grew thick, heavier, with every call, every whisper that reached me through friends in town. They said my children were talking, that my son told anyone who would listen that I was clinging to things I didn't understand. Each rumor landed like another stone in my chest. That evening I sat on the porch in the swing, watching the sun sink behind the fields, and my mind wandered back to the day we buried my wife. The kids had stood on either side of me, my daughter clinging to my arm, my son with a face hard as stone. He barely shed a tear. I remember thinking he was being strong, but maybe it was something else. Maybe he had already begun to close doors in his heart, brick them up against me. The memory cut deeper now, colored by the man he had become. The following Sunday he returned, this time with his wife. She carried herself with a sharpness I had always noticed, a way of looking at me that measured my worth in dollars, not in years of love. She set her purse on the counter, sat at the table, and spoke before I even poured coffee. "You can't keep this up. It isn't fair to the rest of us. We need to plan for the future. The rest of us." Her voice curled around those words, making it clear that in her eyes I was already the past. My son nodded beside her, arms crossed, a silent hammer ready to fall. Their children ran through the hallway, shouting, knocking over the lamp that had burned faithfully for decades. The bulb shattered across the floor, scattering light into shards. I bent slowly, picking up the pieces with hands that once built their cribs, and I felt a tremor in my chest that had nothing to do with age. It was fury, tempered by grief, a mixture strong enough to choke me. I wanted to shout at them to leave, to take their noise and their schemes out of the house that had sheltered their childhood. But my voice caught. As night fell, the silence after they left was worse than their noise. The house seemed darker without the lamp, its absence a wound in the room. I sat in the recliner, staring at the empty spot where its glow had always softened the edges of the night. My son's words replayed my daughter's tone, echoed my daughter-in-law's coldness, lingered. It was as though they were piling wood at my feet, daring me to strike the match. When I finally rose, moving through the dim hallway, my foot caught on something near the door. It was another envelope slid under while I had been distracted by their visit. My hands shook as I picked it up, tore it open. Inside was not paperwork, not a lawyer's letter, but a photocopy of my own will, the original one, the one that still bore his name. Somehow he had gotten hold of it, a copy made before I struck him out. At the bottom, scrawled in his handwriting, were 3 words that froze me where I stood. "Too late, old man." The words on that photocopy clung to me like smoke. "Too late, old man." I stood frozen in the hallway, the paper trembling in my hands, the edges crumpling where my fingers clenched too tight. It was not just defiance written there, not just arrogance. It was triumph, a declaration that he had outmaneuvered me, that all my late-night resolve, the trembling hand with the pen, had been for nothing. The floor under my feet seemed to shift. My knees gave way, and I slumped against the wall, sliding down until I sat hunched, staring at the paper that mocked me with my own handwriting. The house was silent except for the beating in my ears. The weight of years pressed down all at once, every sacrifice, every time I went without, so he could have more, every memory of lifting him high above my shoulders. When he was small, all came rushing back and twisted into something cruel. My chest ached. For the first time since I buried my wife, I felt the collapse of my own spirit, as though the anchor of my life had snapped. I closed my eyes and was carried back to a night long ago when he was just 5 years old. He had a fever that burned through the dark, his little body shaking. I sat beside his bed with a cold cloth, whispering stories to keep him calm, promising him I would never let him slip away. His hand had clutched mine, tiny fingers gripping with a desperation that made me vow silently that no harm would touch him as long as I lived. That vow rang in my ears now, hollow and broken. How had that boy grown into a man who would scribble poison across a piece of paper and shove it under my door like a threat? The collapse grew heavier as more memories spilled through. His graduation day, me standing proud, though my shirt clung with sweat, watching him toss his cap in the air. The first time he drove off in that old Chevy, I worked double shifts to buy the taillights glowing red against the dusk. The fishing trips, the bonfires, the nights when he asked me questions about women, about life, and I answered with all the honesty I had. All of it now bent backward, as if every kindness had only fed an appetite that grew into greed. I pressed my face into my hands, and for the first time in years, tears came hot and steady running down the creases of a face that had weathered storms and layoffs and the grave of my wife. I thought I had no more tears left in me. I was wrong. Grief poured out, not only for what was lost, but for what had been twisted, as if the blood between us had soured. Hours passed in that posture until the shadows stretched long and the house fell into deeper quiet. When I finally stirred, my body felt older than my 71 years. I reached for the drawer where my rewritten will lay, pulled it out, and spread it beside the copy he had left me. Side by side, they looked like enemies. One spoke of my choice, my line in the sand. The other was a stolen ghost, an echo of a time when he still had claim to me. My hands hovered above them both, unsure which held more weight. I thought of my wife again. On her last night, she had gripped my hand and whispered that I must keep the family together no matter what. Those words haunted me. I had tried, God knows I had tried. But what she didn't see, what she couldn't have imagined, was how words and actions could carve chasms no bridge could span. My duty to her clashed with my duty to myself, to the dignity I had left. The next day my daughter returned, this time standing in the doorway with a look not of concern, but of judgment. He told me, "You've changed the will." "Is it true?" Her voice cracked like a whip. I couldn't answer right away. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "How could you do that to us?" To Mom's memory. The mention of her mother's name sliced me open. That was the blade he had given her, the leverage he knew would weaken me. I saw her not as a daughter then, but as a soldier drafted into his war-wielding words that didn't belong to her. I wanted to shout that it was my life, my house, my sweat that paid for every brick and board. But when I looked at her, I saw the little girl in a yellow dress spinning on the lawn, her mother clapping from the porch, and my throat closed tight. I only managed a whisper. "You don't understand." She shook her head and left her silence louder than any door slam. I wandered back to the den, sat heavy in the chair, and stared at the cracked leather of my old work boots resting by the fireplace. I had worn them for years, holes-patched soles worn down each scar on the leather, telling the story of a man who gave everything to put food on the table. I picked them up, the smell of oil and dust still clinging, and it hit me with a violent clarity my labor had become invisible to the very people who benefited most. I clutched those boots like a relic the way some men clutch a Bible. My hands trembled, rage rising with the grief, until a thought sharp as glass cut through me. If they were willing to use my wife's memory against me, if they were willing to forge alliances and dig into my past to manipulate me, then what else were they capable of? What lines had they already crossed without my knowing? I looked again at the photocopy, and my eyes caught something I had missed before. At the very bottom, in faint print from the copy machine, was a date and location. It was not from my drawer at all. It had been copied at a law office in town just 2 days earlier. My stomach dropped. He had already gone further than I imagined. He had taken my original will from the records, pulled it into his hands, and turned it into a weapon. The collapse inside me gave way to a new kind of silence, one sharper and colder. My grief sat beside me, but it was no longer alone. Determination slid in quiet and steady, as though the house itself breathed it into me. I folded both wills, placed them back in the drawer, and sat in the dark. The battle was no longer about a house or papers. It was about my very name, my right to decide the story of my life. And in that silence, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside, slow and deliberate, stopping in front of my house. The tires outside crunched against the gravel, and then stopped. I sat in the darkness, the house breathing around me, my pulse steady but heavy. For a long moment, I didn't move. I let the silence fill me, let it wash over the collapse that had nearly broken me hours before. I thought of the boy with fever, the man with demands, the copy of my own will slipped under my door like a taunt. All of it pressed down, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer collapsing. I was rising slowly but firmly, like a beam set back into place after a storm. I stood and walked to the window. The headlights of a truck glowed faint through the curtains. I knew the shape of it, the dented fender. My son was here again. But instead of dread, a clarity ran through me. I didn't open the door. I let him sit out there in his cab, waiting for me to break. I turned back to the lamp still shattered on the floor from the last visit, its brass base lying awkwardly against the rug. I picked it up and set it gently on the table, the dent catching the dim light. It had survived falls before. So had I. That night, I did not sleep. I moved through the rooms, touching the objects that told my life's story. The walnut desk where I had written letters to my wife when she was away, caring for her sick mother. The worn Bible on the shelf, its spine cracked from years of reading verses aloud to children who fidgeted on Sundays. The tools in the garage handles worn smooth by my palms, some older than my son himself. Each piece steadied me, reminded me that this house was not a vault of possessions, but a ledger of who I was. And if he thought he could rewrite that ledger, he would find my ink darker than his. By morning, resolve had replaced despair. I drove into town, the old Chevy coughing but steady beneath me. At the diner, I sat with a cup of black coffee, the steam rising into my face as I pulled a notepad from my jacket. I began to write not a will this time, not legal language, but my own plan, plain words in my hand. It started with a list of names, people I trusted, still a neighbor, who once helped me mend fences, a retired foreman from the plant, even the pastor whose sermons I had half ignored, but whose eyes had always carried sincerity. If my son wanted a war of papers, then I would build my side with people who remembered my worth. I thought back to my father, a man who worked the fields until his body gave out, who taught me that a man's greatest tool was not his hammer or his hands, but his backbone. Stand straight, he used to say, and the world will bend around you. I had forgotten that for too long, stooping under guilt and memories. But as I wrote in that diner, I felt my spine stiffen again. I made appointments that day, quiet and deliberate. First with a lawyer not connected to the ones my son brought into my kitchen. A man recommended by the pastor, someone who still looked you in the eye and asked about your family before talking fees. I laid the papers on his desk, told him the whole story, every word. He nodded, listening. No interruption, his pen scratching only when necessary. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "You did the right thing changing it. Now we'll make sure it holds." His calm was a balm, a reminder that I was not alone, not powerless. The second step was less formal. I visited the cemetery where my wife lay. Kneeling on the damp earth, I told her what had happened, my voice breaking but steadying as I spoke. "I failed to keep the peace, but I will not fail to keep my dignity," I whispered. The wind stirred the trees as if answering. I left a small bunch of daisies, her favorite, and walked away lighter, my resolve carved in stone, as much as her name on the headstone. In the evenings, I no longer sat, slumped in collapse. I sat at the table with the lamp replaced, its bulb glowing again, and I wrote letters. Not to my son, not yet, but to myself. I wrote what I believed family meant, what it demanded, and what it gave. I wrote about respect, about honesty, about the line between love and exploitation. Each letter was a piece of armor, words forging steel inside me. But resolve alone was not enough. I needed action. One night, as I sorted through the old desk drawers, I found receipts, loan papers, and notes scribbled from years past. Records of the money I had given him, the times I had pulled him out of trouble. Proof. I gathered them into a folder. Each page a story of generosity turned sour. Holding that folder, I felt a grim satisfaction. He wanted to play games with documents. Then documents would be his undoing. Days passed, and I moved with new energy. The neighbors noticed, greeting me with surprise at the straightness of my walk, the steadiness in my voice. They didn't know the storm raging behind closed doors, but they saw the man standing tall again. And inside I began to think not just of defense, but of offense, of how to reclaim what was mine in spirit as well as in law. It was on one of those evenings as the sun bled red across the fields that I heard a sound in the driveway again. I rose calmly this time, no collapse, no shaking. I opened the curtain and saw not just his truck, but another vehicle behind it. The headlights clicked off, and two shadows stepped out. My son's voice carried across the yard, joined by another, sharper one. It was his wife. And between them, in her hand, she held a folder of papers thicker than the one I had collected. As they walked toward the porch, a single thought pulsed steady inside me. The battle I had prepared for was no longer coming. It had already arrived. Their footsteps on the porch boards sounded too loud, too sure. I stood at the door frame, the folder of my own documents tucked under my arm, my body upright, as if braced for impact. My son rapped his knuckles once against the wood, not waiting for me to answer before twisting the knob. They entered as though it were already theirs. His wife carried her folder tight to her chest, her chin high, her eyes scanning the room with the sharpness of someone measuring spoils. "Dad," my son said, his tone carrying false patience. "We need to put this to rest tonight." He nodded toward the table where so many battles had already been fought. "Sit. Let's be civilized about it." I did not move at first. I watched him, the lines of his face taut with a confidence that came not from love, but from calculation. Then I stepped forward, laid my own folder on the table, and pulled out the chair with a scrape that cut through the room. They sat across from me, his wife spreading her papers like a dealer laying out a winning hand. Pages covered with legal language, notarized signatures, copies of financial statements. She spoke with brisk certainty. "We've spoken to counsel. We have evidence you're not capable of managing everything anymore. The house, the accounts, it's all too much for you. The sooner we sign these over, the better for everyone." Her voice stung with the word incapable. I let her finish, nodding slightly, my hands folded calm in my lap. When she slid the pen toward me, expecting my compliance, I reached instead for my own folder. One by one, I spread out the papers I had collected, checks written in his name, receipts for cash withdrawn, notes he had scrawled promising to repay. Years of evidence that I had given, sacrificed, rescued. His face shifted as the pile grew, the smirk dissolving into a twitch of unease. "This," I said quietly, my voice steady, as stone is the record of a father's hand extended. "Every time you stumbled, I lifted you. Every time you failed, I covered the cost. You speak of incapability, but look here, whose incapability kept me working double shifts long after my body gave out, whose incapability made me empty my savings again and again. These are not just numbers. They are years of my life." He reached for one of the papers, scanning it, then tossed it down with a laugh too forced to hide the tremor in his hand. "That doesn't mean anything. Families help each other. You can't hold that against me." I leaned forward, the lamp's glow catching the hard edge of my face. "Help, yes. But this is not help. This is a pattern. A pattern of taking. A pattern of bleeding a man until he has nothing left. And now you want the marrow of the house that sheltered you? No. That ends here." For the first time, his eyes darted to his wife as though seeking direction. She stiffened, her lips pressed thin, but even she leaned back slightly, sensing the ground shifting beneath them. He slammed a hand on the table. "You think a stack of old receipts scares me? I've already got people ready to testify you can't handle yourself, that you're forgetful, that you're slipping." The words hit like stones, but I did not bend. I pulled one last page from the folder, a notarized document from the lawyer I had visited in town, confirming the validity of the new will. I placed it gently in the center of the table. You may twist words, spread lies, drag others into this, but the law recognizes this. My choice stands. You are cut out. His wife's face flushed dark, her eyes narrowing. My son stared at the paper as if it were a snake poised to strike. His bravado cracked. He pushed back from the table, pacing, running a hand through his hair. "You can't do this. You can't just erase me." I stood my chair, scraping back. "You did that yourself when you said I wasn't family." My words hung heavy, and for the first time he had no reply. His breath came fast, shallow panic flickering in the set of his jaw. The silence stretched until the old clock ticked louder than all of us. Then with sudden anger he swept the papers from the table, scattering my evidence across the floor. His wife gasped, trying to gather them, but the damage was done. The documents lay spread like shattered glass, undeniable, unerasable. I did not stoop to pick them up. I let them rest there, visible, a testimony scattered across the room. Instead, I walked to the door, opened it wide, and said, "Leave." For a moment he stood, frozen fists clenched, his body torn between defiance and defeat. Then with a shout that cracked his voice, he stormed out onto the porch, his boots heavy on the boards. His wife lingered a moment, her eyes darting from me to the papers on the floor. She gathered only a few before following him into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, my chest rising, my breath rough. Victory was not sweet. It was bitter ash in my mouth. But it was victory nonetheless. I turned back to the table, the lamp burning steady over the scattered papers, and bent to gather them slowly. As I reached for the last page, my hand froze. It was not one of my receipts, not one of my records. It was a fresh document slipped in among the mess stamped with today's date. My eyes scanned the words, and my blood went cold. It was a petition for guardianship, already filed, claiming I was unfit and demanding legal control over my estate. The ink was still wet. The petition trembled in my hand, as though the paper itself carried a pulse. Guardianship. It was not just greed anymore. It was an attempt to strip me bare, to declare me incompetent, to make me a dependent in the very house I had built. My breath came slow but heavy, and I felt a fire rise that I thought old age had long extinguished. I folded the petition, once slid it into the center of the table, and waited. The next evening they returned, this time with no hesitation, no mask of civility. My son marched in first, his wife at his shoulder, the petition folder clasped tight in her hand. His face was red, drawn, taut, like a wire ready to snap. "You left us no choice," he said. "If you won't act responsibly, we'll make sure someone does. The court will see the truth." I stood tall in the kitchen, the lamp glowing above us like a witness. My voice came low, steady. "The truth. Then let's speak it. You are not here for my well-being. You are here for what you think you're owed." He sneered, shaking his head. "You're paranoid. Everyone sees it but you. You can't keep up with the house, you forget things. This isn't about money." Not about money, I reached for the folder I had prepared, opening it to the stack of receipts, loans, notes, each one evidence of years of giving. I laid them out again, my hand firm, deliberate. "This is about a lifetime of taking. You never repaid a cent. You turned every sacrifice into expectation. And when I said no, you answered by declaring me not family. That is the truth." His wife cut in sharply, her voice slicing. "You're twisting it. Families don't keep score. Families take care of each other." I looked straight at her, my gaze unwavering. "Then tell me, when did he take care of me? When did he stay awake by my bedside through sickness or carry me when I stumbled? When did he repay love with gratitude instead of demand?" She faltered, her mouth opening, then closing, and in her silence I pressed harder. Family is not one-sided. It is not theft dressed as duty. My son slammed his fist against the table, the lamp rattling. "Enough, you think waving old papers makes you right. The judge will side with us. You're too old to fight this." I leaned in close, so near he could see the veins in my eyes. "Too old, I have more fight in me than you've ever carried. Because my fight is not for greed. It is for dignity. It is for the truth of a man's life not being stolen by those who should honor it." The room thickened with silence, broken only by the ticking clock. His breath came hard, his bravado cracking at the edges. I saw in his eyes the flicker of doubt, the fracture of panic. He turned to his wife, seeking her strength, but her face had tightened, her certainty slipping under the weight of my words. She clutched the petition but didn't hand it over. I reached again into my folder and pulled free the notarized will signed and sealed. I placed it directly before them. "This stands. And if you push further these papers," I gestured to the receipts spread across the table, "will stand in court too. Every dollar, every loan, every lie of repayment. They will not see an incapable old man. They will see a father bled dry by a son who mistook love for weakness." He blinked his lips, trembling, his shoulders tight with the battle between rage and fear. "You wouldn't do that," he whispered. "You wouldn't drag your own son through the mud." I straightened my voice iron. "You already dragged yourself." His wife grabbed his arm, hissing under her breath. "We need to go." She pulled at him, but he resisted, his eyes locked on me, desperate, wild. For the first time since this began, I saw not arrogance, but the fragile core beneath it, the boy still craving approval even as he destroyed it. He stumbled back, knocking the chair aside, and finally let her lead him out. The door slammed behind them, shaking the walls. I gathered the papers slowly, methodically, placing them back into the folder. The house hummed with the echoes of our voices, the lamp's light steady, unflinching. I thought it was finished, that I had driven them off for good. But when I bent to pick up the last sheet, a corner of paper that had slipped beneath the table leg, I found something else. It was not mine. It was not part of their petition either. It was a letter folded once the envelope yellowed with age. My breath caught when I saw the handwriting. It was my wife's. She had written it years ago, tucked away in some forgotten drawer, and somehow in the chaos of scattered papers it had surfaced. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Her words stared back at me, neat and firm, carrying her voice into the room. If you ever face our children turning against you, remember this: love them, but do not let them take your soul. Hold to what is right, even if it costs you their affection. You are stronger than you know. The lamp flickered once, as though she herself had entered the room. And as the night closed in, the letter trembled in my grip, a revelation that the battle was not just mine, but one she had prepared me for long before. The letter sat in my hands long after the lamp dimmed her words, etched deeper than ink could ever carry. I read them again slowly, letting every syllable sink into me. Do not let them take your soul. My wife had known even then the kind of storms that blood can bring. Perhaps she had seen shadows in our son I refused to see. Or perhaps she simply understood that love without boundaries becomes a chain. Whatever her foresight, her voice was with me now, steadier than my own heartbeat. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it inside the drawer where my will rested. Paper and ink cannot bind affection, but they can preserve truth. And truth is what I had left, maybe the only thing. I sat for hours in that silence, listening to the house breathe around me. The creak of the porch swing outside, the tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, all of it reminded me that life continues stubborn and ordinary even when hearts break. As dawn rose, I walked through the kitchen and brewed coffee. The smell carried me back to mornings when my wife would hum softly while flipping pancakes, my son rubbing his eyes as he dragged himself to the table. Those memories did not vanish with his betrayal. They remained lodged in the grain of the wood, in the dents of the old table in me. And I realized something then: family is not erased by anger, but it can be corrupted by it. Love is resilient, but respect, once torn, is hard to mend. I thought about forgiveness. The preacher always said forgiveness was freedom, that holding on to anger poisoned the one who carried it. Yet forgiveness without repentance is little more than surrender. To forgive my son blindly would mean allowing him to trample me again. Justice demanded that I stand firm, even if it meant bearing the weight of his resentment. So I began to shape forgiveness differently in my mind, not as a door swung wide open, but as a window cracked enough to let the air flow without letting the thief back inside. I also thought of self-respect, the quiet cornerstone of a man's life. When you are young, you measure yourself by the size of your paycheck, the car you drive, the strength of your arms. But as years lay their weight on you, what matters most is whether you can look in the mirror without shame. My son had tried to take that from me, to mark me as unfit, to strip me of authority in my own house. But I had stood even trembling and said no. That no was worth more than gold. Justice, too, pressed itself into my thoughts. It is not always about courtrooms or signed documents. Sometimes justice is simply telling the truth out loud, refusing to bow when others demand your silence. I had seen men at the factory endure humiliation just to keep their jobs. I had watched neighbors allow themselves to be cheated to avoid conflict. I had lived long enough to know that dignity lost is rarely regained. To stand even alone is justice enough. By midday, I felt lighter. Not happy, no. Happiness is a young man's game. But lighter, as though the burden had shifted from my shoulders to the earth itself, where it could be carried by time. I went outside and sat on the porch swing. The chain squeaked with the same rhythm it always had, a reminder that some things endure no matter the storms. The fields stretched out golden, the sky vast, and I thought about how small we all are under that dome of blue. Small, but not powerless. I closed my eyes and spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. I forgive you, son, but I will not surrender. I will remember the boy you were, but I will not let the man you became steal what little I have left. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of hay and soil, and in it I felt my wife's presence, not as a ghost, but as strength braided into my bones. Evening came again, and the lamp burned steady on the table. I wrote a letter of my own, not to be sent, but to be kept beside hers. In it, I explained what I had learned, that family is both gift and burden, that love must be defended as much as it is given, that forgiveness is not weakness, but boundary. I wrote that justice in a family does not always mean reconciliation, but it must mean honesty. I signed my name at the bottom, with a hand that no longer shook. The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that seeps into your skin and settles you. I knew tomorrow might bring more conflict, more schemes, more arguments. But I also knew I had already won something greater. I had not lost myself. I had not surrendered my soul. That victory was invisible, but it was enough. I sat back in the chair, the lamp glowing amber, the folded letter of my wife resting beside mine. Two voices, hers and mine, side by side, waiting for whatever would come after me. Outside, the night deepened, the stars pressing close against the roof of the sky. The house stood firm, old but unbroken. And so did I. Thanks for listening to the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment to let us know what you think.